Loops, or edge loops as they're more commonly known, are probably the most important concept in 3D modelling. They are behind pretty much every advanced modelling technique and any complex shape that you make, especially when using subdivisions. They are responsible for driving edge flow around a mesh, and they're also responsible for adding detail and also encapsulating detail into certain areas of a model. Now, a very good example of this is this head mesh that I have here, and you'll find this in the sculpting folder inside the content browser. Now we can see if I select my loop selection tool in polygon mode, that all of the areas that will contain a lot of detail in this face, like the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, and the ears, are all encapsulated inside loops. And any detail that you would build into these features would be added inside of these loops. Now, as you add detail, you're adding more cuts, and the thing that we don't want to happen is for our cuts to propagate into the rest of our mesh, as we need to keep all of these areas like the forehead, cheek, neck, etc. very smooth. And this is a very key concept in sort of organic character modelling. Now, the thing is that the same techniques you would use for character modelling like this are directly transferable into hard surface subdivision modelling, and we still use this concept of loops to control our mesh and add detail. Now, you can also see that we also have some fairly strange loops that seem to be moving around this mesh in peculiar ways. But all of these loops are well thought out, and together they combine to make the shape of this head. So being able to control loops like this is very important. These kind of loops also promote a quad workflow as they're all driven by opposite edges. Now, a lot of this course is going to be dealing with how we control and redirect the flow of edge loops to create our base meshes, but also to make subdivision sharpening in our meshes. And I'm hoping that the one thing that you have when you finish this course is a really solid understanding of how loop systems like this work. Here you can see I have a very typical hard surface model that is built using subdivisions. And this shape is obviously a combination of these large kind of sweeping curve shapes that we have around here, with a lot of very sharp detail along these transitional edges. And we have some finer detail in the middle here, like so, which is all connected to our mesh. Now, the trick with a mesh like this is to keep these large, round areas very smooth, and then use a system of loops to sharpen all of these transitional lines without affecting this smooth area. And to do this, we need to build a system of circular loops. If I grab my loop selection tool, you can see the kind of loops that we have going around this mesh. And some of these loops are traveling all the way around this mesh, just like they did in the head model. Now, this is done because the one thing I can't do in this mesh is cut across this circular object in this direction, because it would cause a huge lump in this surface. So essentially everything needs to go around this shape, but join up and merge with all these other edges that we have going on. And these are the kind of edge loops that we're going to be building in this course. Doing stuff like this does take practice. It takes practice to recognize how the loops flow around a shape. And this is indeed just a throwaway practice model. And I would generally, when I was practicing, build one of these kind of things a day just to build those kind of skills. This might look alien to you now, but I can assure you that after we are done with this course, you should be able to read a mesh fairly easily and see how these flows are interacting with each other and understand what's going on. And we'll be using loops in various different ways. You can see I have a system of loops down here which are adding detail into this area without affecting detail in this area. And we'll also get familiar with the fact that loops don't necessarily have to be infinite loops. Indeed, some of the loop systems we'll be building will terminate at border edges, simply because in some models we don't need to model all the surfaces. But if there was, a back face to this model, I'm sure that this loop here would be looping round that surface in some way. So we still think of a loop like this as a loop, even though it's not necessarily infinite. So let's look at the basic concepts of how loops work. Obviously, the simplest form of loop that you can get in geometry is a circle. We have a infinitely looping circle of polygons here in our viewport. And I can select this loop of polygons with my loop selection tool like so. Now this loop of polygons is being driven obviously by this edge loop. And anytime we have edges that are infinitely looping like this, we refer to this as an edge loop. We also have two other kind of edge loops working in this shape, and these are the border edges. And if I click on a single edge, you can see I can select the whole outside edge loop of this shape, and similarly with the inside loop. Now the reason why we have continuous flow in this set of edges is obviously because each vertex on this border edge has 3 edges attached to it. And similarly, the ones in the middle are the same. And we know that this promotes continuous edge flow. Now this system of opposite edges looping around the centre of this shape will also drive my knife tool in loop mode. And if I make a cut here, I have essentially cut in what we would call an edge loop. And in making this cut, I have also created 2 independent loops of opposite edges, which in turn drive 2 independent polygon loops. Now, probably the most widely used example of edge looping like this, or cutting edge loops, is done when we add detail into a cylinder. And obviously, when you use the knife tool in loop mode here, you can see that effectively we are cutting loops into this cylindrical object. And we do this so we can add detail into our cylinder like so. The more cuts we make, the more complex our detail can become up and down this cylinder. And when you cut detail into like cylindrical objects like this, you're dealing with a very singular type of loop. It's moving in one direction, which is around the shape. But a lot of the loops that we make, we're going to want to change the direction of those loops and move them around a mesh. So we should have a look at an example of how we do this. So we're back here with our circular loop. And the one thing I want to point out at the offset is that loops do not have to be circular. If I grab this pose morph tag here that I have on this object and turn up the strength, you can see that all of our edge loops that we had before are alive and well in this square object. Essentially, the geometry is exactly the same as our circular object. It just looks different. Now, this is very important to understand, and it means that we can cut these kind of loops in any shape that we want into any kind of mesh that we have, be it cylindrical or grid-like. So I'm just going to go into a perspective view here. I'm going to bring my axis in, which is Option D or Alt D. And I'm going to hit Command, and I'm going to extrude these edges down like so. Go into polygon mode. Select these polys here and just extrude them up. Now, in extruding these polygons up, what I've essentially done is added 2 more polygons into this loop. And we can still see that the loop of polygons is still functioning. But let's say I want to move this loop in another direction, and instead of it circling round here like this, I want to take this loop and bring it down to the bottom of my mesh and have it circle round the bottom. Essentially what we're going to have to do is redirect the edge flow of this loop. Now probably the first thing I need to do is take care of the fact that we have no bottom face to this object yet, so I should probably add one in. Let's go back to edge mode. We have our edges selected and I'm going to stitch and sew these together. Now the one thing you need to know about stitch and sew is that the edges you want to stitch together need to have the same edge count. Now I have 8 edges in this selection, you can see that here, and I also have 8 edges in this selection, so we're good to go. Now the other thing I need to do is stitch from the original edge selection I made. So I need to stitch from this selection to this selection. Now first of all I want to show you what happens if you stitch the wrong way. So I'm going to grab my stitch and sew tool, I'm going to hold shift and stitch these edges together. Now if I go to polygon mode and select all, you can see that I have reverse normals on the polygons I've created. And I don't want this because all our normals should be aligned. So I'm going to undo that, go back to edge mode, and this time I'm going to shift and stitch from my original edge selection into the middle. Now when I go back to polygon mode, select all, you can see all my normals are aligned. So how do we change the loop flow here? Well, currently the loop is travelling round these opposite edges and we're essentially getting to this diagonal line and this is forcing the direction of the loop over here. Now I want my edge flow to travel from this edge to this edge so I can in turn bring it to this edge and down to the bottom of my mesh, and I obviously want it to then hit this edge and travel round the loop and back up to the top. So how do we do that? Well, essentially we have to get rid of this diagonal edge. Now we created this shape in our second video when we redirected the flow by welding the points to this corner vertex here. So essentially I need to reverse that procedure. What I need to do is cut 2 edges into here and into here like this. Now I could cut this by hand, but that's very long-winded, so I'll show you a quicker way we can do this. What I'm going to do is grab these edges, and I'll grab these edges too, swing this round and select this edge, and connect these edges. Connect is going to split each edge into 2 equal parts, so it will create a point, and it will connect any relevant points it sees together using an edge. Now you'll find connect in mesh, commands, and we have connect points edges. I have mine set to Alt X. So you can see it's created a point on the midsection of these edges and it's connected the vertices together like so. Putting a vertex on this edge, we've created an n-gon and we can see these n-gon lines appear in our mesh. Now luckily for us, these n-gon lines are exactly where we want to place our new edges. So the best way to just turn these into edges is to hit UE, which says remove n-gons. And now I can just come in, select these diagonal edges, which are causing our flow to move around the loop like so, and I can just dissolve these. So effectively now we have changed the edge flow of this loop. Now the loop is running round here, coming down here, it's hitting this edge, which is sending the flow to this opposite edge down, and then the flow is travelling round the bottom portion of our mesh like so, and back up, and rejoining our top loop like so. And if I go into poly mode, get my loop selection tool, you can see this is what we now have. So now we've changed the edge flow of the loop and we're driving the loop into a different part of our mesh. Now we might do this for several reasons. It might be so we can easily add cuts to this geometry for sharpening. And you can see we can obviously make very sweeping cuts around our mesh, and it makes cutting the kinds of lines we want a lot easier. So that's just a very basic example of how we change the flow of a loop. Now things are going to get a lot more complex than this as we go on, and as we start to deal with more complex meshes, our loop systems become more complex, and we have to keep track of these loops and be able to control and send them anywhere we want around our mesh. Now, most examples that I'm going to build throughout this course, all the small little models and everything, are all going to be dealing with this kind of system in some way. And we use this at a very basic level to create our base meshes and make sure our initial flow is good, which then in turn makes it a lot easier to sharpen those objects, and it takes most of the work out of subdivisions. There are many different ways that you can introduce loops into a mesh. Probably the most common way is using the inner extrude tool, and we do this in polygon mode. So if I select these 4 polygons here, I'm just going to hide my axis, and I hit I for inner extrude, and I just click and drag in the viewport, you can see that what this essentially creates is a loop of polygons, which is obviously being driven by a loop of opposite edges. Now before, when we made this kind of shape, this edge was located on the border of our geometry, so it had continuous edge flow. But now these edges reside inside internal geometry, and you can see that we have poles sitting on these corners, which is obviously terminating any edge flow that we had before. The same is true of this set of edges here. There's no continuous edge flow around this loop because these edges reside in internal geometry, and we only have 3 edges attached to these corner points, which again terminates any kind of edge flow. If I were to delete these edges, however, our edge here would now reside on a border edge, and each point has 3 edges attached. So now we get this continuous edge flow around this shape. So in this edge loop, the only continuous flow we have is inside the loop with these opposite edges. Now using this technique, you can make an edge loop around any kind of geometry you want. If I just make a selection of polygons here like this, hit I for inner extrude, you can see that it creates this loop around our selection. And indeed, here we have our loop of polygons driven by this loop of opposite edges. Now you're not constrained to just having one loop. You can have loops within loops, like so. And essentially this is how we can create detail in a mesh. And anytime you're trying to create detail from a mesh that is fairly low res, chances are you are going to do this by adding some kind of edge loop. Another thing that we'll be doing a lot is adding these edge loops to the border edges of shapes that we're making. And again, we can do this in a couple of different ways. We could select all our polygons, hit I and inner extrude like so. Now the reason we do this is to form a protective loop around our shape, and this will be the primary move in making subdivision cuts, which will sharpen corners, or we'll be leaving this kind of corner loop geometry to create curve corners, or making a couple of cuts into our existing geometry to sharpen that up. Again, this is something that you will see me do a lot because I'll be building a lot of stuff in 2D and effectively subdividing the 2D geometry before I extrude it into 3D. Now we can also do this another way, but this time we would be in edge mode and we would have to select our outer edge, and then we can extrude that edge out like so. Now the only difference doing it this way is it actually adds volume to your shape, and your object would increase in dimensions, obviously, because the geometry is being extruded out. And the final way that you can make edge loops in geometry is also in edge mode. And this time I'm going to select my path selection tool. And what I can do is outline a path. And then I can bevel that path, which essentially introduces an edge loop. Now, at the moment, this isn't happening because our metering is set wrong. And we need to set this to uniform. And once we do that, you can see all the n-gons disappear. And now we have this system of opposite edges that are looping, which are facilitating a loop of polygons inside our geometry. So that's a few different ways we can introduce edge loops into our mesh. There are many, many, many more examples of this. This is a kind of a quick overview, but you will get very, very, very familiar with doing this kind of thing.